Diese Konferenz wird nun aufgezeichnet.
Great, so we are recording now. Welcome everyone. This is the Social Innovation and the Climate Emergency webinar. It's organized by the Sustainable Europe Research Institute, SERI, in collaboration with the Thematic Group on Innovation, Technology and Design of the Human Development Capabilities Association, HDCA. My name is Colom. I am one of the co-coordinators of this thematic group, and we have more than 30 registered participants who, some of them we hope will join in, and 4 great speakers with very interesting presentations and a maximum of 2 hours. So I really look forward to this discussion. I think it should be really interesting, and it's also so relevant. As I said, please, could I request you have the mix on mute, also possibly the camera, please, if you can turn it off. And as I said, then when we start the discussion, feel free to, we'll keep it informal, and we can just open our mics and cameras if you wish, so you don't have to. You can also type your questions on the chat box if you'd rather just type it, and then I can pick it up and ask the question at the end. We were hoping to leave the questions for the Q&A after the 4 presentations, but if there's something very relevant that you think really should be asked before we move on to the next presenter, please type it in as well, and feel free to say that in the chat box. And if it's really relevant and needs us not to wait, then we will keep it flexible as much as possible. We have 4 speakers, as I said, with 10 minutes presentation each, 10, 12. And I think, yeah, we're ready to introduce the topic and the presenters. So this session brings together research on the important relationship between social innovation and the climate emergency, and it will ask what are the central issues in research on this relationship so far, and what is the contribution of the capabilities approach and human development in this field. As I said, the speakers have very interesting and extremely relevant papers to the current times in relation to the climate crisis, social movement, civil disobedience, energy efficiency, etc. So these are Rafael Ziegler, founder of GETIDOS, the social ecological research group at the University of Greifswald in Germany, who has led also the organization of this webinar. So thanks so much, Rafael, for bringing us all together, and who will talk about the move from social innovation to militant democratic innovation, which is really, really interesting. And then we also have Josephine Balzac, assistant professor, social entrepreneurship at Rollins College, Florida, who will talk to us about movement lawyering, also extremely relevant to these times. Then Sylvia Lorek, fellow at the Sustainable Europe Research Institute, who will talk to us about energy sufficiency through social innovation. And finally, Asanga Ranasinghe, who is also a coordinator of the thematic group at the Human Development Capabilities Association, and also founder of Stampede Accelerator, who will cover the trend on the relationship between the climate emergency, social innovation, and technology. So I think without further ado, we should just be ready to start. So Rafael, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Anna. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So thank you very much for introducing and moderating, Anna. I'd like to start the first of the 4 inputs with 2 theses on the relation of climate emergency, social innovation, and the capabilities approach. And I have 2 C's on offer. One is basically what could be called cosmopolitan contextualization, where I'd like to suggest that the capabilities approach offers a language to navigate the need for shared global cooperation while paying attention to participation and impacts in contexts. And my second thesis is to say that the capabilities approach can contribute to a critical innovation focus in the line of the hegemonic theory of innovation, which is essentially about technological innovation for green economy in our context, I think. So that's the 2 C's I have to offer, and I'd like to first start with the first one. So clearly, climate crisis, climate emergency requires us to think about significant change to the Earth system, carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, water cycle, and so forth. These are all important Earth system challenges, and in turn, they invite thinking about these challenges in terms of humanity responding to a crisis. And on an abstract level, that is definitely very important for global cooperation. At the same time, we know that social innovation in many ways happens on the local level with projects, policies, and programs on a more local and regional level. And therefore, it's very important not just to talk about humanity as such, but to ask in context who is really impacted by a social innovation and who has a say in it. So if we take, for example, the trend for so-called nature-based solution in cities, municipalities, creating more ecosystem space for water retention and cooling, or creating more space for urban agriculture, green rooftops, urban gardening, and so forth. I think a really important question to ask, especially for social innovation, as the connotation of social innovation is always positive, is always to ask who really benefits from these programs. Are they happening in what kind of neighborhoods? So who will be the beneficiaries? And just as importantly, who is involved in the design and implementation of these programs? And the capabilities approach, I think, because of its participatory origins, is very well suited to contribute to that aspect of social innovation by offering a language that's cosmopolitan, that's used across the world for discussing development, while at the same time being very sensitive to these bottom-up dynamics. So that's the first thesis. The second one is about critical innovation. And the background here is that, so the capabilities approach as a response to economic development and economic growth. I think in the innovation studies context, the context here is that innovation by and large still means a kind of technological novelty for commercial use. So if we're talking about innovation in a climate emergency, I think many people will hear more renewable energies, more technological novelty for green economies. And that again, of course, is an important aspect of response to climate emergency. At the same time, I believe it's a very Janus-phased, ambivalent phenomenon. So if you think of the example of large hydropower, large dams, these have been re-legitimated in a way recently as a source of green energy, arguing that green dams, large hydropower does not produce the same kind of CO2 emissions as coal power does, for example. And so even the World Bank has started reintroducing funding for large dams. Even though it is known that not only do dams behind the wall emit greenhouse gas emissions too, but of course they're involved in big social implications, forced resettlement, and also ecological implications, as large dams tend to destroy the ecological continuity of rivers necessarily. There's not much you can do about that. So it's a very problematic development. And on that level, talking about social innovation then becomes a kind of corporate social responsibility. So a very limited change in social practices where the dam developer or constructor basically discusses as part of this corporate social responsibility how to have mitigation policies that compensate people for the resettlement, or to minimize environmental impact, such as a policy not to build dams in national parks. In practice, moreover, such policies are often disregarded. So there is a problem of what's really happening. And I think the background to that is that for such technologies, there's a very strong technological path dependency and also economic and political path dependency, which basically creates elites and groups that are not really interested in discussing what is the social need, and from that perspective discuss what is really the appropriate technology in that context. Or to borrow a phrase that I'm adopting from an interesting book by Stephen Darcy, there is a context of unresponsive elites that kind of tolerate institutionalized injustice. And in that light, I think we need to move social innovation to a more democratic innovation, that is not only thinking it as a kind of complement to technological innovation, so a sort of CSR, but focus more on social innovation inspired by civil disobedience that takes its inspiration from public protest in the light of manifest injustices. And examples here are the Extinction Rebellion and the Fridays for the Future. And these kind of movements basically try to, they're in my view process innovations, they try to create a space and increase the opportunity costs for not for disregarding such issues, and create public pressure that climate emergency is actually taken seriously. And such militant democratic innovation, so I'm calling it's militant because it has frequently to go beyond the respected boundaries of democratic conventions and say there is here a law that is unjust or that is not justly implemented. And I think it's very important to say this is a part of social innovation, and to discuss the inclusiveness of this too, the transparency, to that it is really remains democratic, as I think it often is, but there is here too a question about it. And to respect at the same time that such social innovation is really also effective, because as we can see in our webinar is actually social innovation and climate emergency, mirroring, I think, a change in global discourse, which I think it can really be attributed to such social movements as the Extinction Rebellion and Fridays for the Future, that we kind of moved on from talking about climate change as some sort of relatively neutral term to phrasing it as a climate emergency. So it does work in changing the discourse, and I think it's very important to therefore consider this as part of social innovations in response to climate emergency. And the second part of this thesis about countering hegemonic innovation theory is that in that theory there is a so-called pro-innovation bias, that is that more and faster innovation is always good. So that's the pro-innovation bias. But from a sustainability perspective, we know that that is, of course, again, something to be debated. Sometimes innovation is good, sometimes it isn't. And to counterbalance that, I would like to suggest that we have to equally consider exnovation, that is the deliberate divestment from discontinuation of social practices and policies, as equally important for considering effective climate emergency policies. So for example, in our institute in Greifswald, I have a lot of Meyer ecology colleagues who study something that happened in response to industrial agriculture, where basically a lot of mires were drained in the past in Central Europe and elsewhere to gain agricultural land. And a drained mire basically releases a lot of CO2 emissions. Globally, about 5% of anthropogenic CO2 emissions are due to drained peatlands. In our province, it's even 35%, so it can be really a big aspect of climate policy. And what this calls for is the re-wetting of mires, so seizing a practice here of dryland agriculture on a mire, on a drained mire. And so that's a very important exnovation of practices and of policies. And I think it should be an equal aspect of our discussion of social innovation and climate emergency, that is equally considering social innovation and social exnovation. So that's for my two theses. And I think if I see Anna's comment, I have regarded the time properly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rafael. That was so interesting, so relevant, and actually leads very well to the next speaker, Josephine Balzac, who is talking about movement lawyering in the context of the climate emergency. So Josephine, over to you. Let me just make sure you have the presenter option on. That's it. Okay.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today for this very important webinar. The title of my paper and therefore presentation is called Movement Lawyering, a Social Innovation to Achieve Climate Justice. So I don't think that we have to much talk about how obviously that climate change is real, it's complex, it's a threat to our existence. This entire webinar is focused on a climate emergency. And so throughout our history, we've had social movements when there is a fundamental injustice that is felt. Communities mobilize to challenge those power holders and/or oppressors. And within these social movements, there is a long history of civil disobedience, and that civil disobedience happens in the name of justice, that the law is being violated. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm having an issue trying to change. Oh, there it goes. Sorry about that, everyone. The definition of civil disobedience is the willful violation of a law undertaken for the purpose of social or political protest. It requires three main elements. One, that the action be illegal, it must be nonviolent, and the actor must accept the consequences of the disobedience. Civil disobedience is connected to our democracy. Many people think that it's a type or form of revolution, but it's actually, the goal is to reform society. And it's very important that the civil disobedience is open and visible, because the ultimate goal is to awaken the conscience of society that a law is unjust. It's a form of nonviolent opposition to oppression, injustice, and environmental harm. And why does civil disobedience happen is because, once again, history really has shown us that the law trails behind what is just. And as Martin Luther King said in a Birmingham jail when he participated in civil disobedience, that one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws, and essentially that an unjust law is no law at all. So the next several slides, I'm going to show you just pictures of these historic social movements where we have seen civil disobedience each time, and essentially proving how law trails behind justice. We saw this in the suffragette movement for the rights of women. We saw this in the civil rights movement. We saw this in the US during the Vietnam War. And it's very relevant. I know that this is about climate emergency, but we are seeing it right now with the Black Lives Matter movement, complete social unrest here in the United States for the police brutality, and Black people still fighting for their lives. And of course, we're seeing it in the climate justice movement. Climate justice is essentially that those most vulnerable, so communities of color, Black people, brown people, those in poverty, small island nations, developing countries, are the ones that suffer the most impacts of climate change, but of course have the least amount to do with contributing to climate change. It connects our rights as humans to climate change. And so the climate movement, and I know that Rafael talked about Fridays for Futures and the Extinction Rebellion, huge movements that are happening, really led by young people and our future generations. But we started to see this climate movement connected with civil disobedience as early as the Keystone XL pipeline here in the United States, where, excuse me, 1,200 people were arrested at the White House. Then we saw most recently with the Dakota Access Pipeline at Standing Rock, over 700 arrests. And so what are these climate protesters and those that are conducting civil disobedience doing? They're shutting off valves They are chaining themselves to railroads, to construction equipment. They're blocking entrances to energy companies. And these are just some of the examples that is going on with the type of civil disobedience in our current climate emergency. So movement lawyers resist the law. So in each type of social movement, movement lawyers have been there to support the movement, but it's really important to understand that these are not the central figures of a movement. The movement lawyers are going to be behind the scene. They're really there to enhance the power of the community. They 100% recognize that those struggling on the street are the key figures, and movement lawyers choose not to follow the law because they see the legal system as part of the problem and recognize the limitations of the legal system, that the law can actually perpetrate the harm that we're seeing. So in a few minutes, I'm going to specifically talk about the Climate Defense Project. These are the co-founders created the Climate Defense Project because in law school they realized that the very system of laws allow government and the fossil fuel industry to destroy our planet. That environmental law is very siloed, that it had little to do or say or address climate change in any way. So as Greg G stated, when governments and institutions fall short, this is the ideal time for entrepreneurial approaches to social problems. So they started this nonprofit to really help the climate movement. So the movement lawyering themes that I saw throughout the legal academia is one, integrated advocacy, which is designed to support strategic collaboration with non-lawyer activists, building community power, and essentially through grassroots movements, shift the power back to communities to give them their voice. And the ultimate goal of movement lawyering is systemic social change. They want to transform the whole system, get to the root cause, because they understand that rule change doesn't equal social change. Social innovation themes, you're looking at co-production and co-creation, the reshaping of power relations, and systemic social change. So I just want to show you the figures. So movement lawyering is a form of social innovation. Integrated advocacy is connected to co-production and co-creation. Building community power is connected to the theme of reshaping power relations, and they ultimately both want to see systemic social change. The Climate Defense Project, their mission is to fill the gap in the legal landscape by supporting frontline activists pursuing climate impact litigation and connecting attorneys with communities. Let me go to so how they are participating through integrated advocacy is that they're creating these horizontal relationships and supporting strategic collaboration with the activists, the community, other organizations, and of course other lawyers. And we really see how they've broken up their structure of their organization by identifying the three different types of services that they will offer. It's not just focused on lawsuits and litigation. Actually, that only equates to 30%. But one of the key innovative approaches that they're utilizing through the integrated advocacy is the use of the necessity defense, which is an old English common law defense that has been recognized in our legal system that essentially shows that that we understand that breaking the law is sometimes justified as long as you can show that there is an imminent danger. Here, the imminent danger is our climate emergency. that what the action that you took is less harmful than the danger. I think anyone will agree that chaining yourself to a railroad is significantly less harmful than the impacts of climate change, that you reasonably anticipated that the action would prevent the danger, and that there was no reasonable alternative to the action. And so how are climate activists showing that there's no reasonable alternative? They're showing that we've lobbied Congress, we've signed petitions, we've voted, we have protested peacefully in the streets, but nothing is working. So this is what we had to do. Although it has been very difficult to use this necessity defense, the Climate Defense Project has been successful in securing 2 appellate decisions that recognize the climate necessity defense. They're also building community power by providing communication power, legal power, political power, and also the use of the necessity defense is an empowering tool as well. And then their ultimate goal is to change the system, to put climate change on trial, and to work to dismantle the systems of oppression by collaborating with others for the greater climate movement. And so I just wanted to throw these thoughts and questions out there for the purposes of our discussion of human development and capability approach. So people are exercising their agency on how to shape their lives and environment through social movements by utilizing civil disobedience and movement lawyering. They see these acts as valuable and as real opportunities to achieve justice in our world. So essentially, how well are people living if they are moved to break the law in the name of justice? What needs to change in order to give them the type of life they deserve? In this climate emergency, without some systemic social change, can we truly develop sustainably and equitably? And can we achieve a life of dignity? So I'm sure that my time is up. I couldn't see my notes on the side with the screen share, but thank you all very much, and I look forward to continuing our discussion once this is over.
Thank you so much, Josephine. So interesting and so much food for thought, and also thank you for your last points that lead us very nicely into the discussion later on as well. So thanks again. And now we'll move on to Sylvia. Let me just make sure I can put you on presenter mode. Yeah, so Sylvia Lorek, Fellow at the Sustainable Europe Research Institute, SERI, who will talk to us about energy sufficiency through social innovation.
Thank you very much. I have to find out how to increase my screen. Let me see, because the GoToMeeting program is above it.
Maybe if you go below, that's it.
Got
Great.
it. Sorry about that.
Welcome.
Should be better prepared. So we are quite shifting the topic. I'm still talking about social innovation, but I'm talking about energy sufficiency. Sufficiency for the good reason. So I hope you are familiar with the IPAT formula, which says that the impact of the environment depends on population and its affluence and the available technology. And what we have talking about climate emergency is so often how technology can bring the solutions. My point of view, or the ZERI point of view, sustainable consumption point of view, is that affluence is at least as important to tackle, because we cannot rely all approaches on saving the climate and the problem through technological solutions. So sufficiency has to come into the picture to cope with affluence. And this already says that sufficiency has to do a lot with the overconsumption we have in the global north. At the same time, sufficiency has another end. Sufficiency also means that people have to have enough so that poverty is dealt with, that needs are fulfilled. And if I talk about sufficiency and energy sufficiency, that means we should come to a level where is neither too much nor too less. So being in a corridor, so to say, the consumption corridors is a quite recent approach to this concept, to the idea of sufficiency. Already a quarter decade ago, we had the environmental space. It's mainly meaning the same. So what I'm introducing to you is coming from a European project, Euphorie, where we, SERI, have tackled with the household perspective of energy efficiency, sufficiency. And there we pointed out, or there we highlighted that from the residential energy use, mainly 2/3 is related to space heating, and even more if you add space cooling. Nevertheless, the dominant suggestions we have out there in political discussions is to concentrate on better insulation for buildings, to have more efficient heating systems, to switch to renewable energy resources, which are all fine. Nevertheless, all this is so often overcompensated through the rise of per capita dwelling space. So what we like to pay the attention to in our project is also to tackle the dwelling space aspect. And there we came up with a handful of directions where we identified social innovations, which I like to introduce really, really briefly here during the webinar. The one is, it is quite useful to shift the narrative. We are telling about energy so far. It is so often out there that we try and hope and intend to rely on the hero messages that the technology will come to save us, which may happen, may not happen, but the message nevertheless is people can lean back. So they can do some behavior change, but in the end, big solutions will come through engineers. This is not at least because the other end of the hero message is that that it would result in horror stories. The horror stories are, yes, but we have failed so far, and if technology does not come to solve us, so we can't do anything anymore. What could be or should be a compromise or something to overcome this dichotomy is that we engage much more in learning stories. So these are in traditional storytelling, it would be the fables or fables. Because there, the acting characters, which are often animals, rely on their own strength. They do not rely on that there is a solution coming from somewhere else, but they have to stand up and do things to bring the challenge. And I think what Josephine has just told with the climate movements might go into this direction. To bring this forward, for example, establishing energy consultancy could be an interesting option. And because that would add or complement to the energy efficiency consultancy we have quite often out there in communities through other channels. Energy sufficiency would broaden the spectrum, and our hypothesis would be, or our suggestion would be, that a plausible start for such a sufficiency consultancy could be at a municipality, at a community level, because they are closest to the citizens and the consumers anyway. So the messages or the knowledge to spread there could be very broad, from training how to best run efficient homes, because as more efficient your home, your house is already, the more impact your behavior has. and you can see that there's a factor 2, 3, 4, depending on how people behave. But it could go as far as allowing people to find out where to move or what to do if they recognize that their flat actually is much too big for them already, and how to find something else, something adequate in their neighborhood. Another possibility for social innovation, which again then goes hand in hand with some technological options as well, is to establish vertical villages. And I like to separate that from the term you may have heard, vertical cities, which is really technology focused. But vertical villages mean recombining, for example, the elements of working and living within one house or within one neighborhood, so that people have really relatively small flats and apartments, fulfilling their everyday and basic needs, while a lot of other things are provided in the neighborhood, in the house, through community services. This could range from a gym through laundry services, and definitely guest rooms, which can be rented for a day, a week, a month, and to make sure that not everyone has to provide that space, which might be filled for 1/10 or 1/100th of the year, but to have them for their own all the time. Another example are the micro-compact student home. Mainly in student cities, there is such a high demand for room, for flat, for apartments, and a big problem, as figured out in Sweden, for example, is that it has to deal with the regulations that 35 square meters are a minimum for apartments. So the micro-compact students home fought and managed to have changes in the regulation that they can go smaller, but still the needs for students, what they need in their apartments, can be met. And then mainly if you have discussions in the US context, the tiny house movement always comes up here for the home solutions, where it is about full equipped houses on extremely reduced space, mainly on trailers, are often movable, because this has a lot to do with the tax system within the US. Shifting again, what is necessary as well, that we need alternative concepts to finance more sufficient homes. This is from the administrative side, switching subsidies criteria for new buildings or for refurbishing buildings is so far always linked to the square meter energy consumption. But that can mean you have an extremely efficient building per square meter, but then only one person lives in there, which is definitely not as efficient as if the same room would be used by 2, 4 more people. So if subsidy criteria could be switched to a per capita basis, then we could do a lot towards sufficiency, which definitely would help to reduce energy consumption in total. Also tax incentives. I think I have mentioned already that there is this empty nest phenomenon. You lived in a building, in a flat, in a house, but then the kids go out, and in the worst case, you are left as the only one, as a widow, and you want to move to another place, to a smaller, but don't know how. So if this would be supported to tax incentives or by information, that would be great. Also, investing into social housing projects is a switch, not from the administrative side, but what people with sufficient amount of money can do themselves. In Germany, we have this Miethaus Syndikat, where people just purposely buy more family buildings from the market, renovate them, refurbish them, and then give them to co-housing projects, to multi-generation groups, so that they are used in a different way than the typical renovate it and then give it to the families or to one or two persons. And housing for help, just last one, is for elder people who like to stay in their flats, but they are too big, so they can rent it to students and don't get money, but get help. So per square meter living area, they get 1 hour per month in help. Final thing is, of course, all this needs stakeholders. Architects and planners so far have in mind that good life means that people have as much individual space, which could be shifted and see that they see themselves as service providers. Housing companies can help to move to smaller units and then release space, of course, for those who need it, families who are still growing. And last but not least, citizens are very important to get engaged in planning their neighborhood, because a good home has a lot to do with a good neighborhood.
Great.
And
Thank you so
I
much.
can't hear you. I have a sound all the time because it is because I'm the moderator and I was talking. I don't know what the reason was. Just take over, please.
No problem. I'll do now. Let me just change the settings to the next presenter. And thank you so much. I introduced you, Sylvia is talking about energy efficiency, but it's very clear now we need to change the narrative to energy sufficiency. So thank you for that. Asanga, co-coordinator of the Innovation, Technology and Design Group at the Human Development Capabilities Association. Over to you. Thank you.
Can you hear me, Anna?
Yes, yeah, we can hear you well.
But you can't see my screen yet, right?
Yes, we can see your screen as well.
Okay.
Not now, it's now, yeah. That's it.
Okay. So good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're connecting from. And thank you, Rafael, Anna, and the other colleagues for organizing this webinar. So I'm going to talk a little bit about tech, climate, and the capabilities approach this afternoon, and maybe try to tie up all these together. Industry 4.0, I'm sure all of you have heard this term. In 2020, we are in the middle of this Industry 4.0, where technology is accelerating at an unprecedented rate. And this Industry 4.0 started in the 1960s when computer and communications technology was advancing, and that was after about 200 years after discovering the steam engine. So what does Industry 4.0 offer us? It offers us both good and bad, just like everything else in society. So you have the autonomous weapon systems, you have the suicide drones, and at the same time, you have drones delivering first aid and vaccines to people, and also technologies like 3D printing, supporting people with artificial limbs, and other emerging technologies like blockchain, which offers transparency and the immutability of data. So it's a big basket of goods. And why do we seem to be obsessed with digital tech? There are several reasons. The first is perhaps that technology is enjoyable. And what do I mean by that? Think of WhatsApp, Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, Googling for knowledge, shopping on Amazon. All of this is made possible by technology. And the device that you have on your palm, which is a smartphone, is what enables you to enjoy all the benefits of enjoyability of technology. And what might another reason be is because it's useful. Technology has brought us microwaves, washing machines, dishwashers, so things that are useful for us in daily life, and that things that makes our lives easier. Now, what you see here on the screen is a house unit, is a housing unit that has been printed using 3D printing technology. So 3D printing technology has advanced so much that you can actually print entire housing units now. Another reason is that technology allows us to advance. For what you see here on the screen is a heart that has been grown in a lab, and this heart is actually able to be transplanted in a human. And the space, the rocket engines, which have been again printed through the use of 3D printing. And of course, the space exploration will help the humankind to advance, to gather knowledge, maybe build a base in the moon or take tourists to Mars. So digital technologies help people advance, humankind advance. And of course, not just advance, but evolve as well. Digital technology is already being fused with the physical and the biological self of people. So what you see here is chips being implanted in people. It's the size of a grain of rice, and it has many uses. For example, it's used to identify people at the workplace. It's used to identify health issues in the body, and this is already happening. So the fusion between the biological and the physical and the technological, the digital technological realms will probably be the next front of evolution in the human trajectory. So far we've seen the uses of technology. It's enjoyable, it's useful, it helps us to advance and evolve. So what's the problem? The problem is that the material required to produce technology, from the silicon in a microchip to the lithium in a battery to all the other rare earths that is required to produce the different components of technology, is through the manipulation of the elements. So humans have, through the years, learned how to manipulate the different elements, and through that produce technology. So these microchips, which powers all the laptops and the supercomputers and helps with the technologies like artificial intelligence, basically, which powers everything. For example, through the process of purifying sand and getting the silicon. And as you know, these elements occur in nature, in climate, and the environment in which we live. And it's not just one aspect of technology that impacts the climate and the environment. It's the entire process of technology. So what do I mean by that? Now, what you see here in the pictures are pictures of mining. So in order to find the raw material which is required to produce technology, mining has to be done, and the mining industry is one of the biggest polluters at the moment. It consumes a lot of energy, it spews out a lot of harmful gases, and then once the raw material is extracted from the earth, it has to be purified. And that purification process in factories also consumes a lot of energy. It's harmful for the environment, it's harmful for the people who are involved in the industry. And then once that material is processed, then that is used to develop different types of technologies, devices, and that too consumes a lot of energy. And it doesn't end there. The usage, us as users of technology, consume a lot of energy as well, which is harmful for the environment. And that is, because of the infrastructure underlying the technology. For example, the internet, the electricity that is required to power this technology. And when we do that, we obviously harm the environment and the habitats in which animals and other living beings live, and that has accelerated negative consequences on the climate and the environment. At this point, I'd like to bring in the aspect of human development and the capabilities approach. So traditionally, progress and growth has been calculated or monitored through the growth of economic wealth. If there is a gross domestic product which increases year on year, then there is economic growth. So the human progress has been traditionally monitored through economic growth. Now, in the late 70s, 80s, and the 90s, this discussion shifted to the human development and the capabilities approach, where there was a call to put the human back in the center of development. And there were several scholars who contributed to this discussion, scholars like Amartya Sen, Martha Nussbaum, and Mahabubul Haq. And for example, the UNDP started producing the Human Development Report since the 1990s, and they came up with the index called the Human Development Index, which looked at other criteria more than just the income. So this shift was really crucial for the environment and the well-being of humans. So the capabilities, what do we mean by capabilities? Capabilities is essentially choices and freedom. So it asks the questions, what are people able to be and people able to do? Are people able to be healthy? Are people able to be sheltered? Are they able to be educated? Are they able to have free time? Are they able to bring up families? Can they form affiliations? So, and perhaps being a social innovator is also perhaps a capability. Does the society allow social innovation to take place? Does the society allow someone to become a social innovator? And what forms these capabilities are the internal capabilities. Those are the individual characteristics of a person. So the physical abilities, the emotional abilities, the intelligence abilities, and that obviously combined with the external socio-economic and political factors is what allows the substantial freedoms, as they call, to be enjoyed by the people. So let's see how the interplay of this is, the tech, climate, and the capabilities. I think the implications of technology on humans, based on what I've presented so far, is very clear. There's a direct red arrow. There's a direct impact on the humans through technology, and also there is an impact on the humans through the environment. Now, the red arrow is perhaps more evident than ever because of this COVID-19 situation, where entire countries were locked down and people's lives were completely digital. Everyone was online, education was online, working was online, working from home, shopping was done through the internet, and this obviously directly affects people because it creates inequalities as well. And so what I see as the possible role of social innovators and activists on two sides. It should promote ethics, values, and principles around technologies, and it should also promote renewable energy to power technology. Technology might be finding solutions for human problems, wicked problems, but if it's powered by fossil fuels, it's counterproductive. So, for example, as a principle, ethics, values, and principles around technology, this is one such example. These are the 9 principles of digital development. This was developed through a process of international participation and donors such as USAID and UK DFID. And these nine principles are, I think, a good start. It's very practical, and it's actually mostly for the industry, where it's for the developers of technology, but certainly we as users could also demand from the developers that these principles are adhered to. And going further, there are other movements like the Tech Festival in Denmark, where it calls for, again, ethics and principles to be at the center of technology. And there is a Copenhagen catalog, for example, the Tech Pledge, which talks about that human-centric technological approach. And of course, promoting renewable energy to fuel tech, because as I mentioned before, technology that is fueled by fossil fuels is counterproductive. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Sam. It's a really helpful way to wrap up the presentations and put us into the context of capabilities and what these issues that have been presented relate to capabilities and how we can think about all these issues. Let me just really change the settings and sorry. Okay, so great. Well, there's already some questions here, which is perfect. I also have a few. This has been such a rich presentation, so there's a lot I think that we can discuss. Rafael, would you like to ask the question yourself if you feel like putting the camera on and having a conversation, or would you prefer us to read them out?
I can also. So thank you very much for the presentations. I just put some into the chat function. I don't know what topic we want to start with. So the first one I thought was very interesting was Josephine's question there with how well are people living if they are moved to break the law. So I was curious what kind of conclusions you draw for policymakers, funders who want to support and advance social innovation from your experience and work with movement lawyering.
Yeah, thank you. So when I started, reading more about human development and the capabilities approach, it just prompted to me what kind of value or what kind of life is someone, what has to push someone to a point and edge that they're willing to break the law in the name of justice, right? So for me, I think first and foremost, it really is about, for policymakers listening, I really think going through those themes of social innovation, of the co-creation and co-production, recognizing what the root cause is, what the issue is, and then obviously doing it through a stakeholder approach, right? Talk to communities. I really believe when it comes to social innovation or any kind of positive change making, you need to have everyone at the table. So policymakers can't just absorb that power and create these kind of top-down approaches, but really creating the bottom-up, the grassroots. And I think sadly at times these are at odds with each other, right? The policymakers are in, some castle somewhere far away, and the other people are struggling on the streets. And I think breaking that down, and that's really what the movement lawyering is about, and social innovation is to be horizontal, right? That we're not in these hierarchical kind of relationships where I know everything and then this is what, I think this is where we've seen problems and where we lead to civil disobedience and essentially these kind of law changes. So that's my conclusion that I draw from a lot of the things that I've been researching and learning.
I was just going to say this, the importance of working horizontally has come up in pretty much all presentations. So I think that it's quite a strong sign of this call, I think, from many parts of the world and many areas, climate emergency and basic social justice issues, this call for change and a sign that things need to change in a different way. And I guess that's where the concept of militant democratic innovation as well that Rafael you presented links very well with also Josephine's point of view from the law aspect.
Absolutely.
Anyone else would like to ask a question in relation to that? Feel free to type as well if you would rather not be on camera, that's fine. Okay, so in the meantime, maybe Rafael, you had a question for Sylvia as well.
Yeah, so that was about the important point of changing the narrative, which I see is read also from the very term climate emergency was already part of our topic in a way. What are we really talking about here?
From my point of view, quite a lot of this bigger is better narrative is so bumped in our minds from media. From if you see the TV shows, they are all in fancy big apartments which are out of reach anyway. And I got it so clear when I was in China once, and the advertising for saving money to have an apartment, it was sold in every taxi. The family with one kid was standing in front of the single house, which is impossible in China, in the big cities. So it's just an image we get in our mind, but it's not too difficult, I think, to take other emphasis. So there is research as well pointing out very clear that it is not the size, it's not even the room temperature or whatever the comfort, that it is the neighborhood, and to have a good community around, which is extremely important. Maybe not for everyone, but for a lot of people. There is this point for elderly people. So what is the purpose of cleaning up all the rooms which are empty? Is that a benefit in itself? And a lot of increase in floor space is also not on purpose, because there are higher divorce rates. There are also, I don't know if it is serious or if we can treat it as a joke, that dating apps where people could come together and live together again would help with the problem. So there are lots of ways where you can approach this, not as a threat, not of a shrinking, a mental, or just how was the wording you used, reduction in life quality. So there are so many ways to, not to sell it, but to make us aware where the increase in quality of life is. And a good surrounding, good green space around, all these things, of course, are very important for that as well.
I guess I was asking because, you know, in a global perspective, you could say that probably slums and informal settlements have the highest population density. And given that we talked about social justice, we don't want to say that this is kind of the attractive way forward.
Absolutely, but this is
why your corridor is maybe very interesting, that you have to think about it from the bottom and from the top. And I think your story is more from the top, right? About
this is the problems I see around. I'm not going out to tell the others how they solve the population problem or whatever. This is not. I have to clean up, to point the finger on the problems in my surrounding, in the European, maybe in the global north problem. If we manage that, we are well off, and then others have to find out how to tackle the other problems. On the other hand, that shows how much we have to reduce CO2 emissions or material consumption, so that it is enough for the others to increase. But that's another paper and another story.
Just a reminder for anyone who wants to ask, please feel free. I'm keeping an eye on the chat box, so I'll make sure that you have an opportunity to ask and to be part of this discussion. In the meantime, though, I wanted to, something I was just thinking, because Sylvia, you briefly mentioned, well, when you were talking about behavior change in a way, and the need to change discourse and narratives. So something that the capabilities approach is known for, it's interdisciplinarity, because it has this broad way of looking at aspirations and human dignity and what people value, and therefore how this leads to social change. So I guess I'm interested from any of you or all of you on how do you think your field is connected and already working in an interdisciplinary way to tackle these issues from a different perspective. It seems from the energy sufficiency approach, kind of a social and behavior change is important, as well as in innovation. From social movements, of course, this is very, political as well, and about networked organization and civil disobedience. So I'm just interested in all these links between all these disciplines and technology and innovation as well.
guess I can start because I'm in an interdisciplinary institute. So landscape ecology has a lot of different disciplines by its, I guess, its very nature. Partly ecologists, but also some landscape economists and philosophy. That's my background. And I think my experience, what was really important, I think is very valuable for such projects, is that there is somehow a space for such research to develop over many years, because sometimes we have this idea, right, that you can in 1 year kind of come up with an interesting project or solution. But what I felt for me personally is very interesting and a real learning experience is that we, for example, have this Meyer Center that has really developed over 30 years now almost. And I think it took that time to develop the sufficient knowledge on this topic of what I briefly mentioned of the draining of peatlands and mires, to understand on the one hand all the natural science processes linked to that, but also to create a kind of relationship between the different disciplines who work on this, and then slowly work on a platform. Who are the different farmers that are involved? Who are policymakers? And so from that perspective, I'm all for interdisciplinarity, but I think it really needs also the fashionable term here is the patient capital, right? So it also is needed for science that these things can develop over time because they are complex. And so you need to have these knowledge competencies that slowly unfold and can't just be done in 1 year or 2 year projects.
I just want to say there's no way that any kind of change or law is going to happen unless it's done through an interdisciplinary way. So for example, even for like the Climate Defense Project, in order to utilize the necessity defense, first and foremost show that these activists that are committing civil disobedience are faced with an imminent danger, they have to put climate scientists and experts on the stand. They have to get evidence from the scientific community proving that we are in an emergency situation. Also, when it comes to technology, so we're starting to see more apps, and the names of some of them escape me at the moment. But when it comes to social movements and organizing, here's the protest, what time are we meeting? We're seeing it right now, even with Black Lives Matter. I'm constantly getting notifications of a new protest happening every day. And then there's also communications in terms of, all right, we're going to be the peaceful protesters. Within these communications, you 10 are going to be the ones that are participating in the sit-in, that are going to get arrested, right? So a lot of the communication is happening through the technology, and obviously, as we mentioned earlier, again, this horizontal type of relationships, utilizing the political aspects of things and many of these other things. But I 100% strongly believe that we cannot have the change unless we approach it through an interdisciplinary way.
Thank you. Very interesting.
So I see a question for me from Rafael about sufficiency and technology. So I don't have a clear answer to that question, but I think it's a very, very important question. Because, for example, now the human development and the capabilities approach, for example, Nussbaum in creating capabilities, she talks about the 10 central capabilities and, giving everyone or bringing everyone to a certain threshold in those 10 capabilities. But now this is looking at it from the other way around. I mean, how much can someone, how much wealth can someone accumulate through technology, which is advancing at a very, very rapid pace, and where is that ceiling? So I think it's a very, very open discussion, and I think it's a very relevant discussion. For example, because of the past 3 months, I'm sure you heard about this. The past 3 months, because of the COVID-19 situation, where everything was online. Through that, we will have the first trillionaire in the world. And that's Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon, and he's going to be the first trillionaire by 2026. So technology certainly brings this aspect of, obscene or luxuries and wealth that is limitless. But I think one way, probably not the only way, but I think something that I'm kind of leaning towards is bringing this aspect of ethics, values, and principles in terms of designing, developing, and deploying technology. For example, the European Union has slapped some really huge fines on big tech companies like Facebook, Google, for breaking antitrust laws or creating a monopoly and thereby killing the competitiveness in the society, in the marketplace. So I think one aspect would be bringing in the ethics, values, and principles discourse into technology to make sure that there is some the design, development, and the deployment of technology is centered around some sort of accepted norm that benefits the majority, or ideally everybody, but at least the majority, in a positive manner.
Thanks, Asanga. We have a question from Sarah to Rafael or also to all. I would like to ask, to address a more abstract level, what does the term social innovation attribute to the public climate emergency discussion, especially concerning the power structures? And where do you see its potential? Sarah, also feel free to put yourself on mic or video if you prefer to have a direct conversation. Either it's fine.
Okay, so I'll start and you others just join maybe with respect to that question. So thank you very much, Sarah. That's a very good question. So I guess that's why my second C was the critical innovation studies. So I do believe we live kind of in innovation societies where innovation is always looked for and everyone finds it great. At the same time, people are kind of unhappy with what's happening with innovation, right? So there's obviously a lot of evidence that this is not going to be the solution. So social innovation in a way links on to the way our societies work and think, while introducing an element that this has to change. And where is the potential here? I think the danger clearly is that it stays in a very incremental pocket, where it's really just about very small incremental change to. That's why I gave the example, maybe I can get back to that, after the large dams, where it's just accepting a technology as it is and trying to modify it, but not really asking what you call the abstract question of what are the technologies for. And so these are difficult, I think, political questions, and to maybe illustrate it with a dam example again. So of course we need to talk about mitigation policies, social and environmental one for dams. But I think the political moment here is to, if you think about social innovation in dams, is that you have a lot of networks. For example, in Europe, there's the Save the Blue Heart initiative for the Balkans. So in the Central former Yugoslavia countries, there is a so-called dam tsunami. That is an explosion of funding for dams under the aspect of green energy, which in all likelihood is going to be extremely destructive of the last wild rivers of Europe. At the same time, there is an energy demand of growing economies, so it's logical that this is happening in a way. And the contribution here of the social innovation, in this case, this Save the Blue Heart initiative, in my view, is to say, look, we need to have an overall sufficiency plan. What energy needs do we need in that region? And then what is going to be the part of hydropower in this, including, for example, can we leave a few rivers simply without dams, and agree that as a political compromise, a few rivers perhaps have to be dammed, but you don't have to dam them all just by some sort of innovation that is then going to be socially acceptable and environmentally harmful. And that's where I think, that's why I was mentioning the social movement as a really important aspect, to have a genuine discussion about technological choice, and not just to ask, given that we have the technology, how can we make it appropriate or something like that.
I have to put a question right at that. I meant more, what does the term social innovation contributes, and not the phenomenon of social innovations in general, but this term. Why I put this term to social movements or Extinction Rebellion? That's what I wonder.
So why to discuss what they're doing as a social innovation? Okay.
Yes.
So for me, that simply means that it's one of way of what they're looking at in terms of being about change in practices, be it as innovation, stopping certain practices, so the dam decommissioning and dam destruction, or living without dams, or in a different way without dams. And I think what the innovation part adds to that is that innovation is always about impact, spreading, diffusion. And so if you have such practices, how can they actually have an impact? And I think that is maybe something that is not always discussed in such ways in these networks, and allows a different kind of lens. How do such ideas spread and diffuse? And that's the innovation part. But I'll let the others maybe comment.
Go ahead, Sylvia. I think you wanted to.
Thank you. I was quite happy about your question, Sarah, because I recognize that my understanding of social innovation is a bit narrower, or less broad, and perhaps different. On one hand, it's absolutely fine. Social innovation, the people who do social innovation are most likely do not know and never heard the term and do not care at all how it is called. They are just doing things. So we as academics call things social innovation, and for good reason, and can confirm that this is fine. But from my point of view, social innovation would be much more with practical results than people going on the street. Even if I see that from Fridays for Future, for example, social innovation might emerge. But in the energy, in the climate context, I would more see that those, what the prosumer aspects, where people just claim the energy provision, the energy production for themselves, and try to do something for themselves in new structures, in new cooperatives. That would be a social innovation where people come together and to do something, whether it is carried out with technology or not, doesn't matter too much. There was another idea which I had, let me read again. Yeah, the power structure, but this would be, again, power structure, be less dependent from the few power companies you have. If you go for smaller units, then it is power in the electricity sense, but also power in the monetary and in the decision-making sense.
Yeah, so I just to piggyback off Sylvia's point. So when I had an interview with the Climate Defense Project, they didn't even know what social innovation was, right? And so here I am putting, you know, a title to something that their work is. The main point of my paper as well is that movement lawyering is a form of social innovation, but again, has not even entered the field of legal academia in terms of calling it a social innovation. So I think it's important also because, you know, grassroots organizations are doing a lot of this, you know, shifting of the power, talking about the power shift, but they don't know that, or aren't necessarily, again, categorizing it as a form of social innovation. And in terms of the power holders, as Sylvia said, I mean, we're looking at these ongoing violations by our, you know, federal government here in the U.S. or governments across the world that are continuing to promote the impacts of climate change, the corruption of the fossil fuel industry, and especially here in the U.S., how it's completely connected to the lobbying and the money that is really funded to deny the science of climate change. And it's significant. It's more significant here in the U.S., although nations around the world are getting sued and are having issues with the climate problem. We're really behind the times here with the fact that we've decided to drop out of the Paris Agreement, or this is all, you know, some sort of hoax that's happening. So I really think that power structure and really trying to go through these themes of social innovation is how we're going to get, as Rafael said, not just the incremental change, but the true systemic change, and that's really where the social movements takes a position here.
I feel that it's also a trend. I think social innovation, in climate change is a trend. You see social innovation being applied to everything else in, all other sectors. For example, in order to alleviate poverty, to support people, you have microfinance. So microfinance is a form of social innovation. So why not use the same approach, social innovation, to a more pressing problem, perhaps more, which threatens our very existence? Why not use social innovation to address such a problem? So I think it's also a trend, and it reaches out to society because it's a popular phrase. And as I think Josephine mentioned, there's a shift in the communities and in all levels of society and hierarchies and industries to social innovation. So I think it's that aspect as well.
Anyone else wants to add something on that, Sylvia?
No, I would like to shift perspective.
Okay, go ahead.
Coming back to something Rafael said in different contexts.
Okay, unless anyone wants to add anything on that, Rafael? No, okay. So I think, yeah.
Add one thing, I think it's clear in the literature, going back to the literature, that climate change is a wicked problem, right? A very complex problem, and that it's been consistently discussed that when it comes to these kind of wicked problems, as Asanga was saying, social innovation really is the solution to those kind of really complex problems. So I just wanted to add that in.
And maybe just one suggestion. I know that Alvaro, I don't know if you can hear us right now, he had emailed me when registering that he's working with his students currently also on social innovation in an emergency context. So I thought maybe he wants to comment from his perspective, I think from Valencia, if I remember properly. But I don't know if you can hear us. Ah, yeah, works.
Hi, Rafael, and to the others. I'm very sorry because I scheduled this webinar at 3 p.m. and it started at 2 p.m. So I'm sorry because I just could attend the Asanga presentation. Yes, we are working about the role of grassroots social innovation and the relation with the climate change. And in our opinion, the social movements, the grassroots social innovation, are challenging the power structures. I mean, they are proposing new ways to deal with climate change. What we are now in the last 3 weeks is trying to research with our students how can they make a little research during the pandemic, during the COVID-19. How can we make little research but with a little or a big impact regarding the climate change? So they had to move online to contact the social movements, to co-design different little research. And at the end, it was really satisfactory because the process was really co-designed with the different social movements here in Valencia. And just on an example, all the works must be related with climate change, but one finding of our process was that it is impossible to isolate climate change from other social injustice. I mean, climate change is really related with the social injustice our society is dealing with. So during their research, many of the students put together findings related with climate change, but also with the vulnerability of the bodies, of energy poverty, or many other issues. So my point is, we need really social innovation to deal with big problems such as the climate change, but we cannot isolate in energy or housing or food. We must need a big picture of all the issues. So it's not an easy problem to deal with. So thank you very much for your presentations, and thank you for the discussion. I think it's really very interesting.
Gracias, Alvaro. Thank you so much. And actually, this links as well to a question from Harsha Patel in terms of, I'll read it in case someone cannot see it. How might the capability approach be applied to engage, include, and empower people from marginalized groups whose voices are not often heard in the creation, development of the various social innovations that you spoke about, in ways that really benefit them, not in extractive ways, and not othering them, so treating them with dignity and not as somehow different. So I said that this links because I would just say co-design and participation is something that has come up not only in Alvaro's comment, but I think in most presentations. But any of you that wants to add to Harsha's question?
I just wanted to add that you know, throughout our history, those specifically that Harsha is speaking to have been deemed crazy, right? And later, you know, they're valued. So I think that that's one of the key things that marginalized groups and communities really want is that respect, right? And that they're justified in their thought, and that we can really bring value to them, and that they're not looked at as crazy, right? The ones that are usually pushing for this kind of extreme and radical are the ones that are, people say, oh, that's the crazy person, but then, you know, history shows us, or time shows us, no, that wasn't the crazy person. That was the person that stood up for what was right in the moment, against all odds and against all opposition. So going back to your point of the co-creation, the co-production really needs to have that at the root, that we really value these voices and want to empower them and raise them up, and not change them, but really listen through the empathy gathering of what their concerns are and their problems are.
Yeah, and if, oh, maybe Asanga first, yeah.
No, go for it, Rafael.
So just maybe if I can add to that, so one experience, because Alvaro had mentioned you know, the current pandemic, I had once the opportunity to work with a really interesting organization called Water Organization Trust Development in India. They basically work in rural communities that suffer from a lot of droughts, and so this really threatens the livelihood of farmers if there is no water. And while I mention this is because they developed, in response to your question of how to empower people from marginalized groups. So these small-scale farmers are, in economic terms, of course, marginalized, but they are also internally power issues, right? For example, between men and women in such villages and caste systems and so forth. And what they did is very interesting, I thought. They started with a kind of conscientization process where every family was invited to understand the watershed development issue, simply how this watershed works and what are the different measures you can take to improve water retention in the watershed, that when it's raining, the water is not directly flowing out again. And based on that, they try to then have on the village level a kind of visioning where people agree on what is their joint effort for this watershed development, and how can they link this to the institutions that regulate and support such policies, in this case in India. And I find this very interesting and linking to the capabilities approach, and would like to recommend there a paper that was published in 2017 in a special issue on social innovation in the Journal of Human Development and Capabilities by Solava Ibrahim. And she calls it the 3C model, where she basically, the first C, if I remember properly, is the conscientization, how marginalized people are put in a discussion space of what is their interests, what are these problems. You know, this might be expert knowledge, like in watershed development, some people know more about it than others, but how does this link to my life and my capacity to aspire? So this, she calls this the first C. And the second one is this community building. If there's a community, like in a village in this case, what's the joint visioning? So this is the second part, just develop what is the community vision on this. And the third one is this about I forgot what she calls this. It was basically about how you link this then to the different stakeholders and institutional power structures with the co-optation problems, and so linked to that. And I think that's a really interesting model for addressing your question about how you can use the capabilities approach to empower people from marginalized groups.
Yeah, so I think just to add to that, I believe the capabilities approach, I think, provides a fabulous normative framework to actually compare, you know, the well-being in different societies and in different hierarchies within a country or a society. And I think when we talk about, you know, the capabilities approach and, you know, the choices that people are able to make, and decide what they want to be and what they want to do. Now, while that's important, I think what's more important is how the choices of other people impact or affect, you know, the certain group in a society. So it's not just the choices that I make and how it affects me, but the choices I make, how does that affect the others? I think that's you know, very important. And then the capability approach allows us to analyze that. For example, if we take the 10 central capabilities from Martha Nussbaum, it talks about, like, you know, for example, the first three, like life, bodily health, and bodily integrity. Now, you see the choices made by a few in society, for example, the wealthy, the affluent, who would want technology to be developed at any cost, you know, with total disregard to the environmental degradation. And as you know, the people who suffer from those choices are the people who are marginalized and excluded. And, you know, for example, you know, because of a polluted environment, people might not be able to enjoy their full life, you know, a normal life. Their bodily health might be suffered, their bodily integrity, you know, for example, if there are natural disasters due to climate change and natural disasters, people are not able to move from place to place freely. So, you know, you can see that there are capability deprivations, you know, that come from certain choices made by people. So I think the capability approach provides it's a great theory and a tool in order to analyze the well-being of people, you know, in all hierarchies in society, so the marginalized and the excluded as well, and find ways through public policy to make sure that no one's capabilities are deprived, and that actually there is freedom in societies for people to be and do what they want.
Yeah, I just wanted to agree on everything that's been said, and also Asanga's point on the capabilities approach really lending itself, because of its normative framework, to methodologies and epistemologies that really look for these approaches that are not extractive, that are dialogical and collaborative. So yeah, I would agree on that. I wanted to ask a question, unless anyone wants to add on this topic. Okay, I'll go ahead, because we still have 20 minutes if everyone's happy to continue. But I wanted to ask a question on time, because we're talking about de-accelerating, or I think, Rafael, you used the term exovation, no? Because it is this acceleration that innovation and technology has led or contributed to, where where we're at the moment, and we really need to change that. But the problem we have is there's not so much time to change that. We are really in an emergency, in a climate emergency. It's not that we have 100 years now to see how we figure it out. And that worries me a lot, really. Like, we're really at the tipping point. So I don't know if any of you, I don't know if that's a question that has answers, but if anyone has any thoughts on how and this different approach to innovation that you have suggested from different points of view can help us do that in a quick way.
I think that's the $1 million question, right?
Yeah, I guess we're all looking for the answer. But well, I guess you've mentioned before, actually, Josephine, the structural change, and perhaps this need to be. This is what allows us to have a drastic change, totally not just a small adaptation of where we're going, but actually just changing the path we've taken. So yeah, I wonder if I have a lot of faith on civil disobedience and structural change, but yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, when you're looking at the different levels of change, you know, you first have like that direct impact, that kind of incremental change. So I do think there is something to be said about small change as long as it's scaled, right? So you have a small change in one community that perhaps can work in another, and then you scale that change. But the ultimate goal would be that, you know, that systemic change. But although as humans, right, we know that change is inevitable, we're extremely resistant to the change. So I think that I wish there was like this really easy answer for me to say, like, how does someone swallow that we need change? And I think it's because, and Asanga mentioned it too, you know, with the those that are more affluent and wealthy and powerful, they have always said through social movements that justice has to be demanded from the oppressed. It's never going to be given, because there are people, if someone's about to become a trillionaire, that are benefiting at the top. So I think that's where that power comes in, right? How can we as individuals stand up collectively and demand that the power is shifted back? But I think that that's just a difficult thing, but I am hopeful, because we've seen these social movements throughout time have made the change, right? We are in a completely different society today than we were, you know, 100 years ago. So granted, we only have 10 years, we don't have 100 years. So the change has to move pretty quickly.
I would like to throw in an optimistic, not view, but hope. So I think COVID could learn from COVID that you never know where the tipping point is. Nobody would have expected that through solidarity and to protect people for health problems, states, governments would be willing to pay billions and billions of dollars and risk billions and billions of euros, yens, whatever, on another place. So I've always come to the point, too frustrated with all the narrow steps we are taking. It's coming in ever shorter times. Nevertheless, these are the steps made on the ground, which hopefully add up, and then we are at the tipping point. And then it's not the thing which solves everything, but that thing which starts the shift. It's not the single solution, but a kick, hopefully, which led all the movements which are there, the ideas which are there, the things which have been provided, the shifts in mind. Yeah, let flow together into a good way. Hope.
Rafael, you wanted to add?
Yeah, so that's a great point about pandemic, right? And the fragility that it shows, where people think nothing can ever change. And then now we're talking about essential services and stuff like this. It seems to be quite possible to have that discussion all of a sudden. But to come back to your initial point, Anna, so for me, I think one really key point is to not to conflate acceleration with the urgency. So the urgency is there and it's well documented for climate change, for biodiversity and so forth. But it doesn't necessarily mean that acceleration in the sense in which our society means it, right? Of more innovation, quicker solutions is going to be the right solution necessarily. Yeah. Dealing with the urgency of the issue. And then I think I completely agree with Sylvia that unfortunately there is not going to be a magic bullet or one solution that actually is probably part of the problem, right? That we think there might be one solution, but there's different interesting strategies that are important depending also on the respective policy and national or geographic contexts. Where in my experience, I think it's really also a moment, and we see that right now, of taking back the responsibility of government in the state as in the historical perspective, actually really important for also Asanga's technology development, right? It was very often states funding for science and so forth that developed these technologies. And so I think it's really important that we now have this, it's sometimes called mission-based innovation discussion of how you can really change economies with long-term state support. I think that's a really important part of the solution. And I guess right now we have the discussion in the EU, for example, where is all this money floating to? Is it going to go car buyback, or is it going to be actually new technologies or changes in technology? So I think that's really important. And for me, the second really important part, and that's, I guess, why I emphasize the social movements, is it's not just going to be new technologies, but sometimes also just not doing things, because maybe the response to urgency is also just not to do something, right? And not just trying to have the next product, but not stopping something is also part of the solution, especially if you consider this efficiency. And the last bit, I don't want to be too negative with that either, is it's great that there is this culture of social business actually happening via social innovation and people having all these ideas, right, of how more locally producing their corporations and so forth products. The only thing I think is, so we have had this culture shift. I think it's much more accepted that social entrepreneurship is also entrepreneurship and so forth. What I just would find is great if we have in that culture also a culture of social innovation and respect for people stopping something, right, as also an achievement in itself, and not just as a placeholder for actually the next innovation.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I think Anna's question was quite a tough one, and you know, it's very difficult to, I think, find an answer to that. But I think we really need to stop looking at growth as the progress in humanity. I mean, Sir David Attenborough said, looking at infinite growth in a finite environment is done either by madmen or economists. You cannot have infinite growth in a finite environment. So I think we need to make a mental shift, individually as well. I think it has to happen at the individual level as well, and stop our consumption patterns. Start moderation in terms of our usage in digital devices. For example, there's no point in me attending this webinar if I switch this off and go and watch something on a large LCD screen, TV screen with the air conditioning on and so on. So I have to actually walk the talk. So I think that sort of shift has to happen at the thought level, that moderation is what will take us to sustainability, and not just over consuming and even consuming the climate emergency debate. For example, there are lots of documentaries being produced, which is very important, but I feel that it's a fad as well, to kind of talk about climate emergency and not do anything about it. So, for example, what I mean is, again, you have a luxurious house, you have air conditioning, you have all these electronic devices, and you're watching, let's say Greta Thunberg or someone talking about, for 1 hour on climate emergency. You're probably, getting the knowledge, you're getting the awareness, but you're not practicing and you're not contributing to solving that problem. So I think, at the individual level, we need to make a mental shift and kind of, as I think Josephine said, scale that up to the next levels.
May I come in here?
Yes, please.
I do not disagree with the individual level. I see the problem as well. Yes, this has to take place, but that might take too long, that we all the millions, billions of individuals get a change. I like to take the opportunity to come back to what Rafael said. I don't know if that was hypothesis or if it is real that people, before dams are built, that the community and all affected by the dams come together to ask, what is the sufficiency scenario? How much energy do we demand? Not what could be provided as soon as we have a dam, but what is our real demand? What do we need? And according to the need, which of course has to be negotiated within society, based on this need, decisions can be made. This would be a huge difference to we come up with a new technology, and now there are new options. So we had the technology of LED lamps, with the result, no effects, but London is never dark again. So technology is, or dams, to stay in the context, might not be the solution. Maybe a proper negotiation. What are the needs in this community would lead to the result that you do not need to buy something new. And the question to Rafael is: was that an example, or was the theory that would be necessary?
So this is it's an example from an ongoing political controversy where there is a huge lobby of hydropower industries that see this as an opportunity to position themselves as green energy. And there's another lobby, which is from nature conservation, which of course want to protect rivers, because a dam is always going to be a very it's big modification of an aquatic ecosystem. And so in the Balkans, there's a discussion which this I think I mentioned it. They're called Save the Blue Heart of Europe. It's an NGO coalition. So they are pushing for the discussion of an eco hydropower plan for the entire region, to have this prior discussion: what are the energy needs, and then what are the different options. So for example, the European Union, it could co-subsidize hydropower, but it could also co-subsidize solar power, right? It doesn't have to be one. So they just want to put this on this prior level of making a plan and then having a more rational discussion, if you like, instead of just letting I think in the end, a kind of rubber capitalism, who has the most money will get it and build it. They also give examples of dams they are built and then they run out of money in the middle, and so it's just the construction side, right? That's left over. So it's a real ongoing controversy, but of course it is not one that has yet come to a definite conclusion. But I highly recommend, if you're interested, to look at their homepage. There's a lot of good information on it.
Well, thank you, everyone. We have 5 minutes left. I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything else, or maybe we start wrapping up. If I see a question popping up, then I still have time to ask it. Otherwise, I mean, it's impossible really to summarize everything. There's been so much, but I think something I take away clearly is from all your presentations and the discussion is we are at a point in time where that it calls for horizontal work and a lot of collaboration. And from an academic point of view, I would add the importance of interdisciplinarity. So I would just like to thank Rafael as well, everyone who took part, and Rafael for organizing and bringing us all together, really in line of this need for horizontal conversations, because everyone comes from different disciplines in a way. So thank you for that. I think I'll let you wrap up, actually, since you organized this.
Oh, I don't have anything to add except for saying thank you very much, Anna, for moderating and for the others for participating. It's nice that we had this truly human development discussion with people from Sri Lanka, United States, UK, Germany, I think even Australia. Here, Helena hasn't said something, but I think she's from Australia and Spain. So thank you very much, all of you, for joining in. Asanga, I don't know if you wanted to say something too.
No, I think I'd like to thank Rafael for taking the lead in organizing this, and of course Anna for moderating, and Josephine and Sylvia as a co-presenter. So glad to have been part of that webinar. Thank you.
And just to say, we will have the webinar available on the HDCA website. We will probably send an email to everyone who participated so that you can have the resource available.
And that Sarah is writing a short report on it, which will be available on the website as well, right?
Yeah, perfect. HDCA website as well, and probably the SERI Institute.
Yeah, that's the plan.
Yeah, great. We'll provide the links. So, yeah.
Thank you, everyone. It really has been an honor. Rafael, Anna, Sylvia, and Asanga, it's been a pleasure to collaborate with all of you and be on this webinar today. And to all the participants as well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.